Hello, my sunshines, and welcome to your session this week with me, Dr. Deborah Brown. And I am so glad that you're here. How are you this week? I hope that you're good, and I hope that you have had a good week and that you are rising above as we all try to do. Today, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about rising because we're talking about trauma and resilience today. Now, this is a very broad topic, so just to let you know, we're not going to get in too deep to the point where we're hoping not to trigger anything uncomfortable in you. This is just sort of a generalized description to talk about what trauma is and isn't, and to talk about what level trauma gets to inside of us and how we might need to adapt or change, and to just begin the conversation because there are 20,000 episodes that we can make from this one because it's such a large topic and there's so much involved in it. But I really wanted to introduce the topic as a way to share with you my views on what I've learned about trauma and some of my experiences personally and with people that I work with, and also to stimulate the conversation because we always want for you to message us and tell us what parts of a conversation were helpful or what parts you want more of. So I'm thinking this is going to be one of those episodes where you go, oh, I want to hear more about that. We are taking some broad strokes today and we are going to go over a bunch of different info. So I'm hoping that you have something that you can take from this today because I want to really emphasize we're not just talking about trauma. We're talking about the concept of resilience, what brings us back from trauma. So I want to start with defining trauma. So trauma is basically something bad that happens to you, something bad that happens around you, and something that gives you an emotional response that is very distressing. So when we think about trauma and its impact, it's about your survival after destruction. The destruction could be to your body, to your psyche, to your home, to someone near you. But how we survive trauma is basically survival after destruction. How do we rise from that? So, trauma is very widespread. It's something that I see very frequently, very often if I have someone come to me and I don't feel right or I'm not navigating my life well. One of the things I dig around in a little bit is tell me what happened to you. Did something happen to you? And it's that old joke about the therapist where you lay on the couch and you talk about your mother and you cry. And I'll tell you what, it's always the mother, just so you know. There's always something in our past that really can affect how we interact with the world. And very often we don't view that as traumatic. One of the things that I hear from a lot of people, and it's very disheartening, is they'll come in and say, well, I mean, it's not like I got shot. It's not like I was beaten. Okay, but something bad happened to you. It's not comparative to somebody else's trauma or something worse. Oh, there are starving, dying children on the other side of the world, and I'm worried about this. It doesn't matter. It's not relative to anybody else's difficulty. And certainly don't downplay it. If something happened to you that changed the trajectory of your life or the way that you feel about yourself, that is trauma. And that can be of differing degrees. There is somebody who can lose their pet, get up the next day, go to work, and move forward and get a new one and not be traumatized. Does that mean they're callous or not caring? No, it just means they process that differently. There are other people who, after the loss of a pet, never want a pet again or don't want to leave their house. So, neither one of those reactions is wrong, but these things affect us all in different ways. But in one case, that might be a trauma. In another case, it might be an event. So, I think that in my experience, nobody gets through this life without bad things happening. Life is also connected to death. We will all lose people that we love. Life is connected to change. We will go through hard things. Life is also connected to events around us, bad things that happen either miles from us or in front of us. But the sad part is that some of us get a disproportionate amount, and we call that compound trauma, where a bad thing happens and then another bad thing happens. And we haven't healed from the first thing that happened. So when the second thing happens, sometimes that's when people come to therapy. They have a difficult childhood and they rise and they go out there and they live. They don't really process it or heal it. And then when something else bad happens, they fall apart and they don't understand why. So I want you thinking about your own history and about things that happened to you, not in a way that I want you to destroy your day or to become sad, but what I want you thinking about is, are things that happen to you still affecting you or shaping you in a way that isn't really what you want? Trauma is very prevalent in the United States, in a country full of privilege, and generally most of us are doing okay, relatively. It's still very prevalent. The statistic, the most recent statistic is that 6 to 8% of Americans have PTSD. So you'll hear that word thrown around a lot, PTSD. PTSD is a mental health disorder and it is post-traumatic stress disorder. So it is prevalent at the rate of 6 to 8% of the population. That's pretty high, right? I believe it's incorrect. I look at the percentage of my patients that come to me and the percentage that I diagnose with PTSD, and it is the single highest diagnosis in my particular caseload right now. And I believe it's because so many people have had traumatic events that they have not resolved or worked through after they happened, and they put them away, and then they come back. It comes back in different ways in their lives. And when I start talking to them about a present stressor, we start thinking about the past stressors and how that might be influencing them now. So there's also another interesting statistic about PTSD, and it's that 46% of people who have substance abuse disorder, who are addicted, 46% of them also have PTSD. So that's a remarkable link between trauma and substance abuse. Your trauma is haunting you so severely that you use substances to escape, and that escape becomes more powerful than your actual reality. So, PTSD untreated can lead to a lot of really bad things. I worked up on our local military base for a while, working with veterans and learning a lot about PTSD in that population. And recent statistics about our veterans show that more veterans recently have died by suicide than by the events in which they participated. It really tells us something about our cultural acceptance of PTSD, that people are not getting help and that people are suffering, and suffering to the point where they can often become self destructive. Now, most of us are not going to do that. Most of us are going to persist through our lives and we're going to feel that kind of nagging, not good feeling sometimes. And sometimes we'll have triggers. And we're going to talk about triggers in a subsequent episode because that's a whole big thing. Everybody talks about being triggered. And it seems a little insulting sometimes to those of us who actually have PTSD and those of us who are getting triggered and know what that really feels like. A trigger is something that takes you off guard, that you don't expect, that's something that happens that knocks you off of your feet. And a trigger is a severe moment that you have to come back from, and you have to get up and you have to come back from. It's not a moment where you go, ew, I didn't like that. We'll talk about that more. We're going to come back to that in another episode. But I want you to understand that trauma is a broad topic, but we can divide it into sort of two types for purposes of this discussion. And the two types of trauma that I consider in my practice are complex trauma and event trauma. So first we'll talk about event trauma. Event trauma is where one thing happens, and after that thing happens, you don't do well. You have effects of it. Event trauma could be like being stuck in a tornado or witnessing a car accident or perhaps the loss of someone very close to you. So event trauma is one thing happens and it changes your perception of reality. So complex trauma on the other side of that is multiple things happen over an extended period of time. And it doesn't just change your reality, it changes you as a person. So I'll explain the difference in real terms. So event trauma, I have that more rarely, but I had someone who was a filmmaker and he mostly did local films on news related topics. And at one point he flew over to a foreign country and it was a very war torn, poverty stricken country. And when he came back from filming there, he wasn't okay. And his wife said, "Why don't you go to therapy and talk about this?" So first of all, he had never talked about what he saw over there beyond what he filmed. And he had never talked about the death and devastation and he witnessed some pretty scary things in a short amount of time. Now, he never talked about it, but yet it was popping up in his day. He was having a flashback where he would see it in front of him while he was filming something entirely different. And it became very disruptive. And what happened was the flashbacks were intense. They were disrupting his work, the quality of his work. He was exhausted and he was snapping at his wife and his children. So, him not resolving that really was affecting the rest of his life. So, he came to me and we really talked about it. And I eventually asked him if he was comfortable sharing. And he told me everything. It was horrifying what this person went through. Vicariously, he wasn't in it, it wasn't happening to him, but he watched it and he was there and it changed him. Now, interestingly enough, this was a person who had had a pretty charmed life, had never had a trauma of any significance, and had a very good life, was very emotionally healthy. So for him, it was even more impactful because he hadn't really been near anything like that before, hadn't really suffered any pain before, or even any severe anxiety. So to suddenly be having flashbacks where he couldn't trust his own mind because he was seeing images that weren't there, people would go, wow, that's bad. He's psychotic. He's not okay. No, he was traumatized and it needed to be processed. So the interesting thing about event trauma is that that's sometimes a pretty quick fix, for lack of a better word. I saw this person for probably about 10, 12 visits, which is really not much in therapy at all. But because he had such a strong foundation and we were able to process what happened, he was able to create a healthier narrative and put it in a place and get it out of the deepest parts of him. He didn't want to tell anyone because it was so dark. He didn't want to hurt his wife or share it with his friends, but he could share it with me. And getting it out of him, as he told these stories, he began to develop a narrative, began to realize that he was safe and that he did everything he could. And after about 12 visits, he was really okay. And he went forth with some skills in his pocket of how to manage some of the anxiousness he was feeling, how to redirect negative thoughts. And it's healable. Was he ever going to be the same? No, of course not. You don't witness things like that, like he saw, and ever be the same. But he was okay and he was healthy and he put it into a chapter in his life of something he had experienced. So that's event trauma. Complex trauma is more difficult to navigate. And that's what I find mostly in the work that I do with people. Complex trauma, also called complex PTSD, is where you've been in situations where bad things happen to you over and over and over again. And you learn to expect that bad things will happen to you over and over again. This can happen in abusive partnerships. This happens most frequently in childhood where there's emotional neglect or sexual abuse or emotional abuse or physical abuse, once you have been beaten by a parent severely several times, you begin to expect that that beating will come and you live in fear of it. If you know someone is going to hurt you over and over again, you live in a certain way and that changes you. So, complex trauma means that everything about your emotional responses has been changed by something outside of you. So, if you have to keep a secret that someone's hurting you, then you then become a secret keeper and you walk around with that secret inside of you. So, complex trauma takes a lot more undoing and a lot more work. And complex trauma is one of those things that I have people who won't even admit it. They'll tell me these stories about the police being in and out of their home because their parents were beating each other up or that their parent was doing drugs in front of them. And things like this, and they go, "Well, but look, I survived. I don't do drugs. I don't have domestic violence in my household." No, good for you, you don't. And that's wonderful. You didn't repeat the cycle. But how can you think you could be exposed to that and not be changed by it? So, undermining your own trauma or talking it down as if it's not a big deal doesn't get you better, doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you not acknowledge something. And acknowledging something doesn't make you a victim. We're not talking about victimhood. If I listed all the things I had been a victim of, we'd be here all day. But instead, I view it as these are things I went through and I survived. And I don't want to use that thing people say where they're like, well, I'm better for all my trauma. No, you're not better. You're hurt. You're wounded. You had to grow around that and you had to work through that. Maybe you are better now than you've ever been, but it's because you were resilient and you overcame it. So a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that this thing might be hard for them or that this thing might be in the way because it was 30 years ago. I have to get over it. Well, as we know, we don't just get over things, we work through them. So, what's the difference between having post traumatic stress disorder and actually just having post traumatic stress? The difference is how it affects us. So, if something bad happens, you're in the middle of a hurricane, that is incredibly stressful. That's traumatic. And you got to rebuild after that. Your house, your safety. When the wind blows, you might be a little scared. But you can have post traumatic stress from an event like that. But is it a disorder? No, because you're going to get on with your life. And if you're still a little scared when the wind blows, you're going to talk yourself through it. And post-traumatic stress is how most people get through trauma. Is they're stressed and they move past it and they get better. But post-traumatic stress disorder is where you don't get better and you get changed. And you may not recognize how it changes you. So some of the ways that it changes you is you might have intrusive thoughts about what happened and you may think about it at a weird time. Um, you may have an avoidance of a particular subject. I have a good example of this one. I have somebody who is petrified of funerals, petrified, and actually to the point where she feared that people around her would die and she'd have to go to their funeral. And she was saying, "Oh, I have OCD and I'm compulsive and I'm anxious." And I thought, wait a minute, you didn't just get this fear. And we looked all the way back to the first funeral she had ever attended, and she was 8. And it was her grandmother who she loved so much. And her grandmother looked horrific in the casket. And her last impression of her grandmother at 8 years old was a cold, hard, dead person that she touched and felt like wood, she said. And it scared her so badly, and then she associated all of those horrific feelings with funerals. Her fear was not of funerals. Her issue was that her grandmother's sudden death was never processed or explained, and she was just put in a room with a dead body, and no one took care of her, and nobody emotionally helped her. So that progressed over decades into, I hate funerals. That wasn't it at all. So if there's something you're avoiding, understand why you're avoiding it. It can show up in hypervigilance, that jumpiness, right? It can show up in odd behaviors. I have to sit in a certain way, or I have to look out that window to make sure I'm safe. It can show up in emotional dysregulation. Your mood is all over the place, up and down. It can show up in nightmares. Nightmares are one of those things that tells me an awful lot about people and what's inside of them. That's another topic for another podcast for sure. So, the most dangerous part of trauma, I think, are two pieces, the trauma recovery. One is your sense of self, your identity, your self-esteem, and the other is our relationships. Our relationships are the context in which our life unfolds. And I'm going to say that again. Our relationships are the context in which our life unfolds. Think of how differently your life unfolds when you're in a partnership than it does when you're not. When you're wealthy and you're in a situation that's different than being poor, your life might unfold differently, but your inside doesn't change. Relationships change what's inside of us, right? Relationships change the way our life unfolds because we're doing it in the context of another person. So if your trauma keeps you from trusting or keeps you from connecting, you're not fully perhaps unfolding in your relationship the way you need to. So what it causes, this unprocessed trauma, is a lack of the ability to connect and a difficulty in sharing. And that's how we connect, is by sharing. But some of us get too good at keeping secrets or attaching shame to that trauma. And it makes it real difficult to trust other people and connect. And you can have all the money in the world and think that's going to make you happy. But the inside of you doesn't shift with money. The inside of you shifts with relationships. So we need to be open to those. And we're not just talking about partnered. We're talking about the relationships with our children and with our friends and with our coworkers. So when I look at trauma and I'm examining it in someone, I look at what I call the 3 E's. It's the event, the experience, and the effects. So the event could be whatever it is that happened, and I need to understand that to understand how to help you heal. The experience, what it was like for you, and the long-term effects. So the experience is an interesting thing, and it can really be the exact same trauma, and two people can really have different experiences of it. If you and I walk outside together and witness a car accident, one of us might walk away from that and go, well, that was terrible. And they go home and talk about it at dinner and don't think about it again. And another of us could go, I don't want to drive anymore. I saw blood that was horrifying. I'm going to vomit, right? The same trauma can impact all of us differently. So this is why it's really important never to undermine your trauma, because you might feel something that other people in the same situation didn't feel. And that's very, very common. So what are the hardest parts of unprocessed trauma as far as how we heal? And we can boil it down to a couple of things: that we lose our sense of safety and security, that we have difficult finding perspective, and that we can't incorporate what happened into who we are. So I think that those are the things I work on when I'm in therapy with somebody for trauma. How do I help them to feel safe again and secure again? That abuse happened to you 20 years ago. Why are you still feeling unsafe when you're surrounded by safety? And I have to help that person believe that. What is the real perspective? Am I broken? Am I damaged goods? That one hurts my soul, right? People will just say, I'm just broken. I'm damaged goods. I'm never going to get better. Not true. People get better and people grow. We only stay broken when we feel like that's our only option and we don't have help. And how do I move forward and make this who I am? There's lots of ways to do that. Some people preach it from the rooftops. Some people go out and say, I survived XYZ, and here's my story. And good for them, because we need that. We need to know that this is not just us. And then other people just go on with their lives. And that's okay too. You don't have to become a poster child for your trauma or what you went through. You really never have to share that unless you want to. Sharing it helps, but you don't have to share it on a broad scale. You can be private about it without it being shameful. That's the key. I think that sometimes we need people to speak up, and we can always find those people and find inspiration in them. One of the biggest ones I've really gone to over the years is someone named Viktor Frankl. So if you've been in therapy with me and you're listening, you know we've talked about him. And the reason I talk about Viktor Frankl is because I just relate to his story and I love his story, even though it's nothing like my story. There are pieces of it that make sense to me. And Viktor Frankl was an Austrian born neurologist and psychologist. And he was born in 1905. He's been gone a little while now. He lived till his 90s. And he published over 39 books about psychology and the human brain and the human experience. There's a lot of good stuff in there for people like me and for people who are not in the field. And he did a lot of studying of people who were suicidal and trying to understand why. And he had some really brilliant ideas about why the meaning of life, I guess we could say. He was into existentialism and really created these whole fields of therapy where we look at our whole life and say, what's the meaning of this? He said that the central motivating force in life was our search for meaning. Well, what derails that more than trauma? Because what does trauma mean? The world is bad. The world will hurt me. If you attach to that meaning, your whole life changes. Interesting thing about Victor was in concentration camps, and he was in concentration camps during the Holocaust in the 40s for 3 years. 3 years. We've all seen the pictures. We have a feeling for what that might have been like. He was in 4 different camps for 3 years. In that time, he lost his mother and his brother to the gas chambers, and his wife to, I think it was typhoid, an illness. He lost everything. He really did. And he wrote on little scraps of cloth all of his ideas about how to make people better and how to address psychological problems and the meaning of life. And he wrote these things, and he wrote these things through fever and through illness and almost his own death due to illness. And those things would be confiscated by the Nazis and burned, and he'd write them again. And he got out. He got out and he lived many, many more years. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And that's going to be your book for this episode. It's a very, very short book, and it's a very powerful book. And it's one I really recommend, Man's Search for Meaning. And there's a quote from the book that I really like, and he says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. So Victor went through hell and had to start over again, but still believed that nothing, out of all the things that were taken from him, that the thing that they couldn't take was his own ability to decide what would happen to him after. So he's kind of a picture of resilience, right? You lose your mother, your brother, your wife, and then you get up and you go back to the field that you started in and you write books and you save other people. That's resilience. Resilience is the quality that makes us get better. And he certainly had it in spades. So, what helps us to survive after destruction? And boy, was that destruction. It's resilience. So, although half of our topic is trauma today, the other half is resilience. Why do some people get better and others don't? Why do some people heal and other people die from it, from this terrible pain. And the reason is resilience. And I'm going to define that for you. Resilience is the ability to adapt and to grow from different experiences. And I think of it as rising. Resilience is the ability to rise every time you fall, no matter how many times you fall. And this is not just a pep talk. This is hard stuff. Resilience is hard to find. And resilience is not some personal quality that you're born with, I think. I think resilience is a belief system that you somehow feed and keep alive. Do you think that you're resilient? Do you think you've come back from things? Do you think you're trying to come back from things? If you're trying, you've already gotten started. You've already gotten your resilience in gear, but you have to feed it. And who has resilience and who doesn't? It's all over the place. And the people that I see that do have it are the people that look for it and really want to find it. There is sort of a story in all of us, and I certainly have mine. And I've told you over the time, my sunshines, that I will give you little pieces here and there. And one of my essential sort of stories is my childhood. I was born into a difficult situation and was abused for a very long time and neglected. And those difficulties culminated in many years later a pretty serious suicide attempt that I obviously survived. And I look back and I go, how did I survive all those years? How do I persist now? And why didn't I in that moment? And what I realized was that there was this little thing inside of me, this little hopeful little girl from the time I was very small, that no matter what was happening to me, there was always a part of me that knew someday I'd get out. Someday I would find something better, and that there was some over the rainbow place for me, just like Dorothy, right? And I really held on to that as a child. And then when I got older at 17 and I ran away from home and ended up being abused in a domestic violence situation for a while, I still had it. And I planned my next running away and my next escape to over the rainbow. And what really matters is that no matter how many times I got down, somehow I got up again. And I don't know how. And then one day I didn't. One day I couldn't get up again. And that's when it culminated in almost my death. And I know now I can look back at that and say, I lost hope. I lost connection. I lost that piece of me that I was supposed to be feeding. So now I always remember to feed her. I always remember to give her what she needs to grow because my resilience is there. It's strong and it's persistent, but it has to be fed. Are you feeding your persistence? Are you feeding that part of you that believes you can rise? And I'm going to read you a poem because I love poems. And Maya Angelou is one of my favorites. And any of you who know Maya know what I'm going to read right now. And she has a poem called Still I Rise. And this is a poem that no matter how many times I read it, no matter how many times I think about it, it's always very powerful because Maya's story is pretty difficult too. You know, she grew up in an abusive situation and she grew up as a strong woman in a country that did not appreciate strong women or especially strong Black women. So her poem about rising has a particular power to it, and I'm going to read it. It's called Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like moons, like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes? shoulders falling like teardrops weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you make it awful hard? 'Cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard? You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. I am a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise. I rise. I rise. That's still powerful, no matter how many times I read it. Because what does she talk about? The depths of the sadness for generations. She not only holds her own trauma, she holds the trauma of all of the people before her who suffered. And sometimes we feel that, especially now, don't we? In an era of a new dawn and a new time in America. So go back to Maya Angelou. She's great for inspiration. Really appreciate her. So we rise not because of who we are, but because of the skills that we can learn to be better than what came before us, to be better than the us that came before us. You know, the me of 10 years ago is not the me today. And the me of 30 years ago is certainly not the me of me today. But they're all in there. And there's an interesting thing that I heard once it was in a training seminar, and we were talking about trauma. And we were saying how we have to be able to greet all of the other versions of ourselves with the same love and regard that we greet our current self with when we are healing. And I really thought about that. And I thought, you put yourself in a room with 5-year-old you and 10-year-old you and 20-year-old you, and picture yourself in a room with all of those other versions of you. Are you being hateful toward them? Are you judging them? Are you blaming them? Or are you seeing them as different parts of you that weathered different storms and really appreciating them and congratulating them for surviving, and reminding yourself that you were all of those things and now you still are all of those things, and that all of those parts of you are your chapters and the different stages of you experiencing and healing. Now, it never stops. There's not some moment that you arrive and everything is all better and all perfect. But we definitely get to a part where we incorporate and embrace all of those pieces of us, all of that little girl who couldn't fight, all of those 20 something years where we did the wrong things because we didn't know what to do, and all of that learning that brought us here today. So I want you to think about rising, but not rising so far above that you don't like the other versions of you who had not risen yet. So really think about that. So what I want to give you is some very preliminary tools today, what I call the trauma 10, my 10 tips for things that can help you to really increase your healing no matter what you're doing, whether you're in therapy, whether you're reading a book, whether you're talking to people you love. These 10 things can be complementary to all of those efforts. So the first is self-awareness. You have to have an accurate awareness of yourself. How am I behaving? Am I being what I want to be? Am I taking out my wounds on other people? One of the best expressions I've heard about that is that if you don't heal your wound, you bleed on people who didn't cut you. That one takes my breath away because it's true. You are looking at yourself as a victim and hurt and all of that, which all could be true. But the person with you, your child, your partner, your friend, it's not their fault. So you have this sort of obligation to make sure that you're fixing what wounds you, or you will hurt the people around you. It's not just about you hurting yourself, but you'll hurt the people around you. Number 2 is mindfulness. And check out last episode. We talked a little bit about mindfulness. And we're going to do that again. We're going to talk about that at length. But mindfulness is about being present in your life and not carrying all the baggage all the time. Trying to be in a moment versus getting lost in the past. And with trauma, that's a very real danger. We really can get lost in the past. Number 3, coping skills. What do you have to hold on to that makes you feel better? What can you do when you really are triggered? What can you do when you don't feel good and you can't get a thought out of your mind? Where's your list of magical things that you can do that will take you away from it all? And maybe it is a bath or a movie or a talk with a friend. And maybe that one small step that you take towards something that helps you cope can get you out of a bad pattern of thinking. Coping skills work. We don't want to hear about them because they're hard, but they work. Supportive and trusting relationships is number 4. How on earth can you have a trusting relationship when you've never relearned that people are safe? So, having supportive and trusting relationships is a part of your healing and taking a leap of faith. I can tell you from my own experience, trust is a major leap of faith for me. I do not give it easily and I do not give it widely because it's harder for me because of my trauma. People that loved me, were supposed to love me, were the people that hurt me the worst in my life. So trust for me is a hard one. So I don't expect you to give that easily. And I expect people around you to kind of earn it. But don't shut that down. Don't believe you can never trust someone again. Number 5, physical well being. How many times do you not take care of yourself because your brain hurts, because you feel like garbage, and then you don't take care of your body? Taking care of your body is very, very important in your mental health, and especially for people with trauma. People with certain kinds of trauma have learned to be neglected, and therefore they learn to neglect themselves. Make sure you're not doing that. Number 6, setting limits and boundaries. There are things you never have to do, and there are things you should do and shouldn't do. But certain things that make you feel worse are things that maybe you don't have to do and you can set a limit around. If there's a place that you go that reminds you of a bad event, maybe you don't have to go there. So, limits and boundaries. Take care of yourself. Number 7, purpose, connection to values, right? This is a big one for all mental health. Is are you connected to what's really important to you? And are you living your life in that way? That's what purpose really is, by the way. Purpose is you're living according to the things that are important to you. Number 8, taking action. This one is about not just standing in your pain, not just standing still, getting help and improving yourself instead of thinking that you're some broken toy, because you're not. Number 9, maintaining balance. Overwhelm is the enemy of healing. Say it again. Overwhelm is the enemy of healing. When you are out of balance and you are overwhelmed by your life, it is very hard to heal. Think about how to maintain balance. One of the biggest thing people come to therapy for is this very thing. They don't know it, but it's what we figure out. Their life is out of balance. Too much of something, too little of something else. And number 10, positive self-talk. We talked about this a few episodes back. What you tell yourself about your life is really what your life becomes. And the terrible thing about trauma is that people taught you the wrong lessons. They taught you the wrong things about humanity or about life or about your environment. And I want you to think about the fact that you are perpetuating some of those ugly ideas, perhaps, in your own self talk. Whose voice do you hear? Is it the person that hurt you or is it yours? So, our when to fix it conversation, and that's what we have when we talk about a lot of these things. When is this something that is problematic? Well, if a lot of this resonated with you in a big way today, probably a good idea to start thinking about it. If you have some things that are happening in your life that don't make sense or you can't understand why you do, but yet you can look back at your past and go, yeah, there's stuff I haven't healed from. Go to therapy. I'm always going to tell you to go to therapy. I think everybody can use therapy. Doesn't have to be forever. Or talk to somebody about it that you trust. See what their opinion is. And read. I am a big fan of reading. I will always give you a book because I think we see ourselves through other people's stories. That's why reading and art and literature and music and all of that becomes so important. Most of the beautiful things that we read and that we see are products of creative expression, a lot of it after trauma. And people share those stories in their art and in their music. How many breakup songs are there on the radio? You know, after a breakup because you hear them all. But art is a great way to connect to other people who have been traumatized and sometimes people that have risen. And that's the message I really want you looking for. How do people move on after something happens to them? And you can find a lot of that in the movies. There are a lot of great movies with great stories about people who have risen above. And a lot of people think it's corny and they think it doesn't apply to them. But the humanity's greatest superpower is to keep going when things are hard. And that's resilience. I want you thinking about your own resilience. And if it needs some patching up, let's work on that. Let's make that a priority. Okay. So, next time when we get together, we're going to expand on one of the things we talked about today. We're going to talk about limits and boundaries. And I think it's an important topic because a lot of people come in and say, I've heard I have to set boundaries, but I don't understand what that is. Part of our healing is about being able to set limits and boundaries in our life. So, we're going to talk about that in the next episode. So, be ready. I'll be here. So, thank you, my sunshines, for coming to your session today. We know that change is hard, but it is possible. And I want you to make sure that there is enough sunshine in your life. It's going to rain sometimes, but we've got to have some sunshine. So, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. Bye.